June 2, 1944, 4 days before D-Day, Dover, England. Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann adjusted his camera as he made his fourth pass over the English coast. Below him, clearly visible in the early morning light, sat what appeared to be an enormous invasion force. Hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and landing craft assembled in staging areas near Dover. The intelligence was unmistakable. The Allies were preparing to invade France at Pas-de-Calais, exactly where German high command expected. Hoffmann's photographs would be analyzed within hours by German intelligence officers, confirming what other reconnaissance flights, signal intercepts, and agent reports all indicated. The main Allied invasion would strike at the narrowest point of the English Channel. This intelligence would influence German defensive planning and the positioning of panzer divisions that could have devastated the actual Normandy landings. What Hoffmann could not see from 20,000 feet was that he had been systematically deceived. The tanks below him were not steel and armor. They were rubberized canvas inflated with air pumps. The artillery pieces were wooden frames covered with painted fabric. The landing craft were plywood shells. This entire army was a theatrical production, an elaborate deception that would help determine the outcome of World War II. This is the story of Operation Fortitude of the Ghost Army, and of how inflatable deception technology fooled the Luftwaffe and contributed to Allied victory. This is the story of the bizarre inflatable tanks that changed the course of the war. Military deception is as old as warfare itself, but World War II elevated deception to unprecedented sophistication and scale. The challenge was convincing enemy intelligence that large military forces existed where they did not, drawing enemy attention and resources away from actual operations. Traditional deception methods had severe limitations. Building wooden mock-ups of tanks and aircraft was time-consuming and required substantial materials and labor. The mock-ups were heavy and difficult to move, limiting their tactical flexibility. Most critically, they looked convincing from some angles but obviously fake from others, particularly when observed closely or from certain perspectives. The British discovered inflatable deception technology somewhat accidentally through their civil defense preparations. In 1940, civil defense planners were developing inflatable structures for emergency shelters and medical facilities. These structures used rubberized fabric that could be inflated rapidly, collapse for transport, and re-inflated repeatedly. The technology worked well for its intended purpose, and someone in military intelligence recognized its potential for deception. The first military inflatable decoys were simple inflatable fuel tanks and supply dumps designed to draw German bomber attacks away from actual facilities. These decoys were crude but effective enough to warrant further development. By 1942, British engineers were designing inflatable vehicles, tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that could be inflated in minutes, moved easily, and appeared convincing from aerial reconnaissance altitudes. The engineering challenges were substantial. An inflatable tank had to maintain proper shape under wind loads, appear realistic in various lighting conditions, cast appropriate shadows, and withstand repeated inflation and deflation without tearing. The fabric had to be durable enough for field use, but light enough to remain portable. And the visual details, tracks, gun barrels, antennas, camouflage patterns had to be convincing when photographed from aircraft. The solution used rubberized canvas with internal support structures. The basic shape was maintained by air pressure, typically 2-3 psi provided by hand pumps or small compressors. Critical details like gun barrels and antennas used rigid supports. The exterior was painted with authentic camouflage patterns copied from actual vehicles. Even minor details like spare wheel assemblies and external stowage were replicated. A complete inflatable Sherman tank weighed approximately 85 pounds. One man could carry it. Inflation took 15 to 20 minutes with a hand pump. Once inflated, the tank measured 19 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 9 feet high, exact dimensions of a real M4 Sherman. From 1,000 feet altitude, the standard altitude for tactical reconnaissance, the inflatable was virtually indistinguishable from actual tanks. The Americans, recognizing the technology's potential, contracted with several rubber companies to produce inflatable decoys. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company became the primary manufacturer, leveraging their experience with rubber fabrication to produce thousands of inflatable vehicles. By 1944, production capacity reached several hundred units per month across various vehicle types. Operation Fortitude represented the most ambitious deception operation in military history. The goal was simple but profound: convince German intelligence that the D-Day invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, and that the forces involved were substantially larger than reality. The plan involved creating an entirely fictional army, the first U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, and positioned in southeast England, preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais. This fictional army existed in German intelligence assessments, in falsified radio traffic, in reports from double agents, and critically, in visual evidence that German reconnaissance would photograph. The visual deception required creating the appearance of massive troop concentrations, vehicle parks, and supply dumps across southeast England. Physical construction of mock-ups on this scale would have been impossible. It would have required more materials and labor than could be justified and would have taken months to construct. Inflatable decoys provided the solution. In the months before D-Day, British and American deception units deployed thousands of inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces across Kent and Sussex. The deployment followed careful planning to ensure the installations appeared realistic. Inflatable tanks were positioned in tactical formations that actual tank battalions would use. They were spaced appropriately, oriented correctly, and accompanied by appropriate support vehicles, some real, many inflatable. The deception went beyond simply inflating fake equipment. Teams of soldiers created realistic signs of activity: vehicle tracks in mud, latrines and tent areas, communication antennas, and command posts. Real vehicles drove around the mock-up areas to create dust and tracks visible from the air. Radio operators transmitted authentic-sounding military communications using proper protocols and encryption, creating electronic signatures of large formations. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed these installations repeatedly. The Luftwaffe's photo interpreters analyzed the images carefully, counting vehicles, identifying unit types, and tracking changes over time. They saw exactly what the Allies wanted them to see: a massive invasion force preparing to strike across the narrow part of the Channel. The deception's effectiveness was validated through ultra-intelligence decrypted. German communications revealed that German high command believed FUSAG existed and represented the main invasion threat. When the actual Normandy landings occurred on June 6, German commanders initially interpreted them as a feint, expecting the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. This misperception kept substantial German forces, including panzer divisions, away from Normandy for crucial weeks. The inflatable deceptions continued after D-Day. As Allied forces advanced through France, deception units deployed inflatable equipment to simulate forces that didn't exist, confusing German intelligence about Allied strength and intentions. These tactical deceptions supported specific operations, drawing enemy attention away from actual attack sectors. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known unofficially as the Ghost Army, represented the tactical application of deception technology. This 1,100-man unit, activated in January 1944, specialized in sonic, radio, and visual deception. The visual deception element operated inflatable equipment as part of comprehensive deception operations, supporting the advance across Europe. The Ghost Army's operations followed a consistent pattern. The unit would arrive in a rear area, receive a mission to simulate a specific division or corps, and deploy inflatable equipment along with supporting deception elements. A typical operation might simulate an armored division, approximately 15,000 men and 350 tanks, using 150 to 200 inflatable tanks plus supporting vehicles and equipment. The inflation and deployment procedures were carefully choreographed. Soldiers worked in teams, each responsible for specific vehicle types. They would unpack the deflated equipment from trucks, lay it out in proper positions, and inflate using hand pumps. A four-man team could inflate a complete tank in under 20 minutes. A full divisional deception might take 4 to 6 hours to deploy completely. Once inflated, the equipment required constant maintenance. Wind could reposition lighter pieces or cause tipping. Inflation pressure had to be maintained through regular checks. Battle damage from nearby artillery or small arms fire required patching. The soldiers learned to repair tiers using tire patch kits, maintaining the deception despite minor damage. The operations were not without danger. The Ghost Army often positioned itself deliberately to attract enemy attention and fire. German artillery sometimes targeted the fake installations, and occasionally struck real positions where the deception troops were working. Several soldiers were wounded during operations, and the constant proximity to actual combat operations created stress despite the unit's non-combat designation. One notable operation occurred in September 1944 near Brest. The Ghost Army simulated the 2nd Armored Division, which had actually been withdrawn for rest and refitting. The inflatable tanks and accompanying deception convinced German forces that the armored division remained in position, influencing German defensive planning. The operation succeeded so well that German prisoners later captured expressed surprise that they hadn't faced the expected American armor. The deception units developed remarkable skill at selling their illusions. Beyond the inflatable equipment, they understood that authenticity required comprehensive attention to detail. They played recorded sounds of tank engines and vehicle movements. They established fake command posts with appropriate radio traffic. They created vehicle maintenance areas with appropriate equipment and activity. These supporting elements made the visual deception convincing to anyone observing, whether from the air or ground level. The inflatable deception technology, while effective, had specific limitations that required careful management. Understanding these limitations reveals both the sophistication of the deception operations and the constraints deception planners had to work within. Weather posed the most significant challenge. High winds could destroy inflatable equipment or render it obviously fake. A tank tumbling across a field in the wind would immediately compromise the entire deception. Operations were typically planned for periods when weather forecasts indicated moderate conditions. When unexpected storms arose, deception units had to deflate equipment quickly to prevent damage and detection. Rain and moisture affected the fabric's durability and appearance. The rubberized canvas could become waterlogged, changing its appearance and making it heavier. Prolonged exposure to moisture could cause the rubber coating to deteriorate. Maintenance procedures included drying equipment when possible and treating it with protective coatings to extend life. Temperature extremes also created problems. Cold temperatures made the rubber brittle, increasing the risk of tears during handling. Heat made the material more pliable, but could cause excessive expansion if equipment was left inflated in direct sunlight. The temperature also affected internal pressure equipment. Inflated in cool morning air might become overpressurized as temperatures rose, requiring pressure relief. The visual realism had distance limitations. From 1,000 feet or higher typical reconnaissance altitudes, the inflatables were convincing. But from ground level at close range, the deception was obvious. The material's flexibility was visible, the painted details appeared less realistic, and the lack of actual weight meant the vehicles didn't settle into the ground properly. This limitation meant inflatable deceptions had to be positioned where enemy ground observers couldn't approach closely. Movement was perhaps the greatest limitation. An actual tank force moves, with vehicles changing positions, driving to new locations, and creating dynamic activity. Inflatable tanks were static. They stayed wherever they were positioned until soldiers moved them. Creating the illusion of movement required periodically deflating equipment, moving it to new positions, and re-inflating. This process was time-consuming and required careful planning to avoid German reconnaissance observing the same positions repeatedly. The equipment's lifespan was limited. A well-maintained inflatable tank might survive 20 to 30 inflation cycles before wear, tears, and material degradation made it unusable. The Ghost Army and similar units had to constantly rotate equipment, returning worn pieces to rear areas for repair or replacement while bringing forward fresh equipment. This logistics requirement meant substantial stocks had to be maintained. Despite these limitations, the technology succeeded because it was employed intelligently within its capabilities. Deception planners understood what inflatable equipment could and couldn't do, and designed operations accordingly. The equipment was one element in comprehensive deception schemes that included radio traffic, sonic deception, false radio traffic, and real troop movements, all coordinated to create convincing illusions. The inflatable deception equipment's contribution to Allied victory is difficult to quantify precisely, but was certainly significant. Operation Fortitude's success in keeping German forces away from Normandy during the critical first weeks after D-Day probably saved thousands of Allied lives and ensured the invasion's success. The tactical deceptions throughout the European campaign disrupted German planning and created uncertainty that Allied forces exploited repeatedly. German intelligence officers, when interrogated after the war, acknowledged that Allied deception had been highly effective. They described analyzing reconnaissance photographs that showed exactly what the photographs showed: tank parks, vehicle concentrations, supply dumps, without recognizing the deception. The combination of visual evidence from photography, electronic evidence from radio intercepts, and human intelligence from double agents created a comprehensive picture that happened to be false. The Germans had their own deception programs and used some inflatable equipment, but never at the scale or sophistication of Allied operations. German deception focused primarily on tactical camouflage rather than strategic deception, partly because they were generally on the defensive and had less opportunity to conduct large-scale deception operations. Post-war analysis revealed that the inflatable deception technology worked because it exploited the limitations of aerial reconnaissance. Reconnaissance photographs provided overhead views from specific altitudes, angles, and lighting conditions. The inflatables were optimized precisely for these viewing conditions. Features that would appear obviously fake from other perspectives looked entirely realistic in reconnaissance photographs. The technology influenced Cold War military thinking about deception. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces maintained inflatable deception equipment as part of their tactical arsenal. The Soviets, in particular, invested heavily in deception technology, producing inflatable tanks, aircraft, missiles, and even ships for both strategic and tactical deception operations. Modern military forces continue using inflatable decoys, though the technology has evolved significantly. Contemporary inflatables incorporate radar-reflective materials to create appropriate radar signatures, not just visual appearance. Some include thermal elements to replicate heat signatures that infrared sensors would detect. The materials are more durable, the designs more sophisticated, and the manufacturing processes more advanced. The Ghost Army remained classified until the 1990s, when the unit's operations were finally declassified and veterans began sharing their experiences. The soldiers who served in the unit had maintained their secrecy for decades, telling families only that they had served in a special unit without explaining the deception operations. The revelation of their work generated substantial public interest in this previously unknown aspect of the war. Several Ghost Army veterans became prominent artists and designers after the war, perhaps not surprisingly given that many had been recruited for the unit specifically because they had art and design backgrounds. Their experience creating convincing illusions under pressure apparently translated well into peacetime creative careers. The story of inflatable tanks fooling the Luftwaffe illustrates a fundamental principle of warfare. Perception often matters as much as reality. The Germans devoted substantial intelligence resources to understanding Allied capabilities and intentions. They collected extensive information through reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and human sources. They analyzed this information carefully using trained specialists. And they reached conclusions that were exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. The deception succeeded not through any single element but through comprehensive, carefully coordinated operations where inflatable equipment played a crucial visual role. The equipment itself was simple technology: rubberized fabric, air pumps, and paint. But its deployment reflected sophisticated understanding of intelligence collection methods, psychological operations, and the integration of multiple deception techniques into convincing narratives. The soldiers who inflated these fake tanks and maintained these deceptions contributed to victory as surely as those who drove real tanks in combat. They faced danger, endured difficult conditions, and executed complex operations that required skill, dedication, and attention to detail. Their work remained unrecognized for decades, but it helped determine the war's outcome. Today, when we think about World War II technology, we typically focus on dramatic innovations: radar, jet engines, nuclear weapons. But sometimes the most impactful technology is the simplest rubberized canvas shaped like a tank, inflated with air, positioned carefully and photographed by enemy reconnaissance. That simple technology, employed by creative and dedicated soldiers, helped win the intelligence war and contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The next time you see an inflatable decoration or structure, consider that similar technology once changed the course of history, one inflated tank at a time.